7:45, June 8, 1943. The morning sky over northern France trembled with the steady growl of Pratt & Whitney R. 2,800 engines, 12 cylinders firing in a deep, even rhythm that vibrated to the metal skin of every cockpit in the formation. The air smelled of warm oil, cordite, and the faint chemical trace of high-altitude oxygen leaking from worn fittings. Frost clung to the inside edges of the canopy, melting into thin rivulets as sunlight cut through the haze. Ahead, the early light turned the French countryside into a blurred patchwork of green and gray. And somewhere below that patchwork, invisible for now, Luftwaffe patrols were already forming. Robert S. Johnson pressed his gloved left hand against the throttle, feeling the hum of power from a massive radial engine. His P-47 Thunderbolt, heavy, rugged, and famously overweight in the eyes of many early critics, shuddered slightly as the formation climbed. The aircraft's armor plating and 8.50 caliber guns made a beast, but its weight also earned it years of mockery from pilots who preferred fast, elegant fighters like the Spitfire or the nimble German FW-190. Even some American pilots joked the Thunderbolt felt like flying a bathtub with wings. But none of that mattered now. This was war, and Johnson was learning what mattered most: survival. As a 56 fighter group crossed the French coast, thin streaks of moisture raced along the canopy glass. The P-47s had been tasked to escort 8th Air Force bombers returning from deep raids, a dangerous point in every mission, when damaged B-17s and B-24s often limp home alone, attracting German fighters like wolves circling a wounded animal. The radio cracked with static. Keep your eyes open. Bandits were active over Rouen earlier. Voices came clipped and tense. At altitude, sound was always sharp, brittle, and slightly hollow, as if filtered through cold iron. Johnson scanned the horizon. Even through his oxygen mask, he could smell the burnt metal scent of the engine heating under strain. He shifted in the cockpit, feeling the creaking resistance of his parachute straps. A bead of sweat ran down his temple despite the freezing air. He wiped it away with the back of his glove, smearing a thin layer of frost across the inside of his visor. Somewhere above 25,000 feet, danger always felt close enough to touch. Just a year earlier, few commanders would have believed the P-47 would become the backbone of American escort operations. Early models had suffered from teething problems: poor range, unreliable radios, engine issues. And there had been the endless comments about its size. The Luftwaffe pilots who first saw the Thunderbolt reportedly called it the biggest target in the sky. But in 1943, something had changed. Engineers solved the radio problems. New drop tanks extended range. Pilots learned how to use the P-47's massive weight not as a limitation, but as a weapon. And one characteristic stood out above all the others: the Thunderbolt's ability to survive dives at speeds that pushed the limits of physics. The heavier the aircraft, the faster gravity dragged it down. And the faster it went, the harder it became for enemy fighters to follow. Johnson understood that better than anyone, and today he was about to learn how much one dive could decide the difference between life and death. The formation approached the Seine River, the green-brown ribbon cutting to the French landscape. Johnson checked his instruments, altimeter holding steady, temperature within limits, oil pressure stable. Everything felt normal, but war rarely announced itself until the moment it struck. Then a shout over the radio: "Break! Break! 190s, 10 o'clock high." The words sliced through the calm like a blade. Johnson's heartbeat kicked into his throat. His eyes snapped to the left. Dark shapes, small, fast, unmistakable, slashed across the sunlit sky. FW-190s diving in perfect formation, their wings glinting silver, their radial engines roaring like chainsaws ripping through air. The German fighters had the advantage of altitude and momentum. Johnson rolled aggressively to the right, feeling his stomach rise sharply as the G-forces shifted. The Thunderbolt's weight gave it stability, but it also demanded strength. Every movement of the control stick felt like wrestling a machine built from thick steel bones. His shoulder muscles tensed as he pulled, the harness straps digging into his chest. Tracer rounds tore through the formation, bright, fiery streaks. Some passed close enough that Johnson felt the vibration to the airframe, the strange, subtle shock wave that accompanied near hits. He squeezed the trigger. The 8.50 spat fire. The sound wasn't a crack or a pop. It was a deep, violent buzzing, a mechanical thunder that rolled through the cockpit, shaking every rib in his chest. The FW-190 scattered, then regrouped with frightening discipline. Their pilots were veterans, men who had survived the brutal air combat over France and Russia. They knew how to exploit every weakness in enemy aircraft, and they believed the P-47 had plenty. Meanwhile, back in England, engineers at Wright Field and Republic Aviation had spent months studying German aircraft performance. Reports showed a limit the FW-190 struggled with: high-speed dives. Beyond a certain point, the 190's control surfaces stiffened, and the aircraft risked structural failure. The Thunderbolt, built around its massive radial engine and thick fuselage, had greater tolerances. It could push deeper into those speeds before hitting its aerodynamic wall. But none of those reports meant anything now, not to a man with tracers flashing past his canopy. Johnson rolled, dove, turned, returned fire. Minutes blurred into a chaos of noise and vibration. His hands trembled slightly, not with fear, but with adrenaline. Beneath him, the French fields whipped by in a swirl of green and brown. Then it happened. A burst of 20 millimeters fire struck his P-47. The sound was unmistakable, like a giant hammer slamming into the airframe. Johnson felt the aircraft jerk violently. The canopy frame shook. A panel near his left wing root peeled open, trailing smoke and debris. He tried to breathe and tasted metal inside his mask. Something hot stung his left arm. He checked the controls. They still responded. Barely. He tried the canopy release. It jammed. He didn't know it yet, but this moment, this exact second, was the beginning of one of the most famous survival stories in the air war over Europe. But survival required understanding the enemy, and the enemy understood him. High above, an FW-190 pilot, an ace by the precision of his maneuvers, banked sharply, setting up for a perfect diving attack. He had seen American fighters die under far less damage than Johnson was carrying. He tightened his harness, steadied his breathing, and angled into position. Johnson saw him too. The sudden flash of sunlight on the 190's wingtips, the shape rolling inverted, the dive beginning. Johnson's pulse thudded in his ears. The controls stiffened. The wind noise grew into a scream. What happens when a too heavy fighter is pushed beyond every limit? What happens when the enemy refuses to break off? What happens when an aircraft's reputation hangs on the moment a man is fighting simply to stay alive? Johnson gripped the stick harder, his knuckles whitening inside the glove. He eased the P-47 into a deeper dive. He knew this dive, not his guns, not his armor, would determine everything. The aircraft groaned, metal flexing under pressure. Air rushed past so fast it felt like the entire sky vibrated. The nose pitched down. Altitude numbers spun, and the FW-190 followed. But the P-47, for all its weight, all its mockery, had one advantage the Luftwaffe did not fully understand yet. A dive this steep, this fast, was a different kind of battlefield. The question wasn't who fired first. It was who held together long enough to survive the fall. Johnson pushed the throttle forward. The R-2800 roared, straining against physics. And for the briefest moment, he felt the rush of acceleration press him deeper into the seat. A crushing weight, like invisible hands holding him down. The airframe shook again. The FW-190 closed in. Johnson's vision blurred. The canopy rattled. The altimeter spun faster. And in that freefall over France, as two aircraft screamed toward the earth, Johnson began to understand the truth that engineers had known all along. Truth his fellow pilots had doubted. Truth the Luftwaffe was about to confront for the first time that morning. The overweight Thunderbolt was not slow. It was not clumsy. It was a machine built for the kind of dive no FW-190 pilot wanted to follow. But the pilot behind him still didn't know that. And Johnson had seconds, maybe less, to prove it. Part 2 will continue the story from this exact moment. revealing how the dive unfolded, how Johnson survived the FW-190's repeated attacks, and why this event changed the reputation of the P-47 forever. The altimeter spun so fast the needle blurred, and the wind tore at the weakened skin of the Thunderbolt as Johnson forced the dive deeper. The vibration in the cockpit increased. First a tremble, then a violent shaking that rattled the oxygen mask against his face. Every instinct screamed at him to pull up, but instincts didn't matter here. Survival depended on physics, engineering, and the one advantage he still had, the reputation of the P-47 that so many had mocked. Somewhere behind him, the FW-190 pilot closed the gap. Johnson could feel it even without seeing him, an almost animal sense of danger sharpened by adrenaline. The air around the canopy shimmered with compressibility effects as the pressure built. The P-47 was approaching speeds that could bend control surfaces, lock elevators, or tear metal from rivets. Below them, the fields of northern France rushed closer. They weren't shapes anymore. They were textures, rough lines of hedgerows, shimmering patches of water, flickers of shadow where the morning sun struck roofs and roads. Johnson gritted his teeth and held the dive. The Thunderbolt was heavy, 3 times heavier than some early American fighters, and because of that weight, it dropped like a stone when pushed into a steep angle. Engineers at Republic had built a thick wing, a wide fuselage, and a robust internal structure. All those details, invisible in combat, were now the thin line between life and death. Yet even that might not be enough. At a certain speed, airflow over the wings shifts. The elevator stiffens. Control response drops. Pilots call it the wall, a point where the aircraft stops listening. Many fighters could not survive passing through it. The FW-190 was approaching its own wall. German test documents, later analyzed by Allied engineers, showed the 190 suffered heavy control stiffening beyond about 500 miles per hour in a vertical dive. Even the bravest ace risked blacking out or losing control if he stayed too long. But the German behind Johnson wasn't backing off. Not yet. Johnson risked a glance over his shoulder. A flash of gray. The FW-190's nose pointed straight at him. The pilot was committed, too committed. Perhaps he believed Johnson was already severely damaged and would bail out. Perhaps he wanted to finish the kill for good. Or perhaps he underestimated the Thunderbolt. A sudden jolt snapped Johnson back forward. Another hit. Another burst of 20-millimeter shells. The FW-190 had managed to close the distance enough to fire even as both fighters plummeted. A chunk of metal ripped free from Johnson's left wing and spun away. Smoke streamed behind him. Holes opened across the fuselage, vibrating with the airflow. But the dive continued. The ground surged upward. Gravity dragged the Thunderbolt faster. The German followed a moment longer. Then physics intervened. The FW-190 fell slightly out of alignment, wobbling in the airflow. A subtle movement, just a few degrees, but enough to reveal the truth. The 190 was reaching its limit. The nose shuddered. The wings buffeted. The German pilot realized the danger and leveled out slightly, trying to ease the pressure. That hesitation saved Johnson. It bought him seconds. Seconds to survive the fall. Seconds to regain control. Seconds to breathe. Johnson pulled gently on the stick. The P-47 resisted, then responded. Not much, but enough. The heavy aircraft stabilized. Airspeed bled back into manageable numbers. The ground stopped filling the entire windshield. Seconds later, the Thunderbolt roared just above treetop level, flattening crops with its wake. Johnson felt a surge of disbelief and relief at the same time. His heart pounded. His hands shook. But he had survived the dive. The FW-190 hadn't crashed. Its pilot had leveled out in time, but he hadn't followed Johnson to the full descent. He had backed away, given space, lost a chance to finish the kill. Johnson had escaped the one moment every fighter pilot feared, being chased in a steep, uncontrolled dive. But the fight wasn't over. As the Thunderbolt leveled out, Johnson reached the throttle and steadied it. The engine roared unevenly at first, coughing smoke, but then returned to its familiar growl. The cockpit smelled like burning insulation. A faint stream of oil trickled along the right side of the canopy frame. His left arm felt warm, blood mixing with sweat. He checked the instruments. Temperature fluctuating. Fuel leaking. Radio damaged. Guns jammed on one side. Then, above him, a shadow across the sun. The FW-190 was back. Johnson looked up, and for a moment, their eyes almost met. Two pilots, two machines, one battlefield of air and speed. The German pilot banked sharply and dove again, lining up for another attack. Johnson had little to defend himself with. He tried to fire. The guns stuttered. Smoke, but no rounds. The jam from earlier hits had worsened. He had only one functioning gun, and it sputtered weakly. 8.50 calibers, reduced to 1. Firepower cut to barely a tenth. He knew he couldn't win a dogfight now. He had only one option left: survive. The 190 dived with precision, closing in from behind. Tracers ripped past canopy. Johnson rolled instinctively, the Thunderbolt's heavy wings responding slower than before. The damage controls felt soft, untrustworthy, but he forced the aircraft into a shallow climb, then a hard turn. The FW-190 matched him easily. The German pilot must have seen the hits across the Thunderbolt. Shredded panels, oil streaks, a jammed canopy. Yet the American fighter still flew, still maneuvered, still refused to fall. The German adjusted his angle again, preparing a finishing burst. Then something unexpected happened. As he came in close, dangerously close for a fighter, making a kill pass, the German held fire. The 190 pulled alongside Johnson's damaged P-47 for a brief, surreal moment. The canopy glass between them reflected morning sunlight. Johnson could see the German pilot clearly now. Helmet, goggles, mask. A man, not an enemy silhouette. The German looked at him, assessing the nearly destroyed Thunderbolt wobbling in the air. And then, according to Johnson's later accounts, the FW-190 pilot shook his head slowly. He extended one gloved hand from his cockpit, palm up, fingers splayed, a gesture that meant only one thing in the brutal logic of aerial combat. You're finished. A farewell. The 190 rocked its wings lightly, almost like a salute, then banked away. The German believed Johnson was going down, sooner or later. No need to waste ammunition. No need to risk another close pass. The skies were full of American fighters. He needed to conserve fuel and ammo for surviving the return trip. He turned toward his own lines, and for a moment, the sky went still. Johnson stared after him, shocked, exhausted, barely processing what had happened. His aircraft was full of holes, his controls unreliable, his guns almost useless, his canopy jammed shut, and he was still deep over enemy territory. But he was alive. He steadied his breathing, slowed his thoughts, focused on the essentials: altitude, heading, engine temperature, fuel. The P-47 was hurt, but its heart was still beating. The R-2800 radial engine, scarred, smoking, leaking, refused to die. That engine, designed for extreme punishment, had already saved countless lives. Today, it was saving one more. Meanwhile, back at their base in England, pilots of the 56 Fighter Group were counting losses. They knew the day had been chaotic. They knew German fighters had struck aggressively, and they knew Johnson had been separated during the fight. But nobody knew if he was coming back. Johnson nursed the damaged Thunderbolt across the countryside. Every minute felt like 10. His arms ached. His eyes burned. His left side throbbed with pain. The canopy's jam meant no fresh air, only the hot smell of smoke, oil, and metal. He flew on. Then on the horizon, a familiar sight appeared: the pale line of the English Channel, a thin, shimmering barrier between death and safety. Crossing it felt like crossing a lifetime. As he approached his base, he radioed in. His voice cracked, the signal weak, but audible enough to confirm he was alive. Ground crews rushed to the field as he approached. They watched in stunned disbelief as the P-47 limped home, holes punched across the wings, sections torn open, leaks visible even from the ground. Johnson brought the Thunderbolt in for a landing, fighting every moment to keep it stable. The wheels touched down, bounced, then settled. The aircraft rolled to stop. Silence. Then the ground crew surrounded it in shock. They had never seen a P-47 this badly damaged return from combat. Some parts looked like they had been chewed through with giant teeth. The canopy was blistered and jammed tight. Oil streaked the entire length of the fuselage. When they finally pried the canopy open, Johnson climbed out slowly, legs trembling. He didn't say much at first. He didn't need to. The aircraft said everything. Engineers later counted more than 200 bullet and shell impacts on his Thunderbolt. Some sources record 21 major hits from 20mm cannons alone. The fact the aircraft still flew was more than luck. It was design, engineering, and the ruggedness that critics had mocked for years. It was also a sign of things to come. The P-47 wasn't just survivable. It was redefining what American fighters could do. Johnson's dive and the German pilot's failed attempt to follow it became one of the most studied incidents in use-off analysis circles. Engineers confirmed the Thunderbolt's ability to survive high-speed dives far beyond what many fighters could endure. Training manuals adopted new tactics. Pilots learned to use the dive as a defensive weapon. The Overweight fighter had proven its worth. But the climax of Johnson's story and the legacy of survival carved into World War II aviation was still ahead. The hangar lights flickered dimly as dawn clouds passed overhead, casting long shadows across the wounded Thunderbolt. Ground crewmen walked slowly around the aircraft, their eyes widening with each new hole, each ripped panel, each twisted fragment of aluminum. The smell of burned oil still clung to the engine cowling. The metal crackled as it cooled, like a living thing catching its breath after surviving a storm. Robert S. Johnson stood beside it, silent. The reality of the last hour was still sinking in. The dive, the bullets, the German pilot's farewell gesture, the unbelievable return flight across enemy territory. He touched the wing's rough, torn edge with his fingertips. The metal felt jagged and warm. The P-47 had saved him, not through luck, not through magic, but through the thick armor plates, the massive radial engine, the dense internal structure, everything skeptics had mocked as overbuilt and overweight. Now, those same qualities had kept the aircraft alive long enough for him to come home. Behind him, footsteps echoed. Colonel Hubert Hub Zemke approached, commander of the 56th Fighter Group. His face was usually stern, cut sharp with the pressure of leadership. But as he looked at Johnson's aircraft, even he paused, momentarily speechless. Later in life, Zemke would say he had never seen a fighter so damaged still capable of flight. The colonel didn't speak for several seconds. He simply walked alongside the aircraft, eyes scanning every scar. Then he turned to Johnson. "You rode her hard today." It was understated, but those few words carried weight. Respect, recognition, and something else. A realization that the P-47 had just proven something remarkable in combat. Johnson managed a faint smile, though exhaustion pulled at his expression. "She brought me back." Zemke nodded. "And the Germans will remember this." They did. In the following weeks, German intelligence reports circulated among Jägerschwede units. The FW-190 pilots had already respected the Thunderbolt's dive capabilities. But Johnson's encounter, when analyzed from the 190 pilot's point of view, made one thing clear. A P-47 in a vertical dive was not worth chasing beyond a certain limit. Not unless a pilot was willing to risk structural failure, compressibility effects, or blackout. This wasn't propaganda. It was physics. And every pilot in the Luftwaffe knew it. Meanwhile, American engineers pored over Johnson's aircraft, documenting the damage in meticulous detail. They examined holes through control surfaces, ruptures along the belly, dents in armor plating. They mapped each impact on a technical diagram, noting how the structure had absorbed force without collapsing. One engineer, according to witness accounts, tapped the thick engine cowling and shook his head in disbelief. This thing flew home with damage that would have torn another fighter in half. The data from Johnson's aircraft became part of a larger evaluation that informed new training guidelines for P-47 pilots. They learned how to use dives to break off enemy pursuits, how to trust the durability of their machines, how to maximize the strengths of a fighter many had initially misunderstood. The Thunderbolt wasn't meant for delicate maneuvering. It wasn't meant for slow turns or tight spirals. It was built to strike hard, dive fast, endure damage, and bring the pilot home. And now, everyone knew it. In the days after the mission, Johnson tried to return to normal operations, but the memory of the 190 pilot remained vivid. There was something haunting about the moment when their eyes had met in the air, something human, something that war rarely allowed pilots to acknowledge. Two men, both fighting for their lives, both believing the other might die in seconds. What went through the German pilot's mind? Was it frustration, respect, pity, or simply a calculation? No point wasting ammunition on an aircraft that was already doomed? Johnson didn't know. He would never know. But he remembered the gesture, the slow shake of the head, the gloved hand extended, palm up, a signal of inevitable defeat. And he remembered how wrong that assumption had been. That moment became part of the 56 Fighter Group's lore, retold in briefings, at mess tables, during quiet moments between sorties. It became a symbol of the Thunderbolt's resilience, a reminder to every new pilot who doubted the aircraft's size or weight. As word spread, Johnson received congratulations and questions, but he didn't boast about the encounter. According to those who knew him, he simply explained the truth. It wasn't me, it was the airplane. This humility, paired with the undeniable facts of his survival, made the story more powerful, and the Thunderbolt itself underwent a shift in reputation. Pilots who once preferred lighter, more agile aircraft began to appreciate what the P-47 offered. Ground attack missions expanded. Dive tactics became standard practice, and the fighter that had been dismissed as an aluminum truck grew into one of the most respected Allied aircraft of the war. But the emotional climax of Johnson's story wasn't written in the wreckage of his aircraft, or in engineering reports, or in pilot briefings. It came weeks later at altitude. Johnson was back in the air, this time leading a section of fighters across the English Channel. The sky was clear. The engine hummed with familiar, comforting vibration. The horizon stretched endlessly ahead. Yet beneath the calm, he felt a tremor of memory from that dive, the moment he'd waited for death, the moment he'd believed he'd never see home again, the moment he'd seen a German pilot wave him off as finished. Now he was here, alive, flying, leading. As the P-47 climbed into sunlight, Johnson realized something profound. Survival in combat wasn't just chance. It wasn't just training. It wasn't even courage. It was engineering. Men he would never meet, designers, metalworkers, engineers at Republic Aviation, had given him the chance to live through something no human reflex could have overcome. Their decisions, made in factories far from the front, had traveled with him into combat, wrapped around him like armor. When the FW-190 sprayed fire across his fuselage, it was their rivets that held, their plates that deflected shells, their structural design that kept the aircraft from breaking apart in the dive. Pilots often said prayers before missions, but in a quiet moment above the channel, Johnson felt something else: gratitude, not to fate, not to luck, but to the machine that had given him a second chance, a machine he would trust again. History would remember Robert S. Johnson for many achievements: 33 confirmed victories, becoming one of America's top aces, earning the Distinguished Service Cross, and contributing to the evolution of use-off tactics. But for the men of the 56 Fighter Group, his legacy was something more personal. He had shown what the P-47 could survive, what it could endure, and what it could do in the hands of a pilot who refused to surrender. The story of his dive became a symbol, one that rippled through training manuals, technical discussions, and even enemy assessments. The lesson was simple. The Thunderbolt was not to be underestimated, not in strength, not in durability, not in combat. In an era when many fighters relied on speed and agility alone, the P-47 demonstrated a different kind of excellence, one built on ruggedness, firepower, and raw survivability. It wasn't elegant, it wasn't sleek, but it brought its pilots home. That mattered more than anything. As the war progressed, Thunderbolts filled the skies over Europe, tearing through enemy lines, diving on ground targets, escorting bombers deep into Germany. They became icons of American air power, bearing the bold markings of the 8th and 9th Air Forces. Checkerboard, stripes, and vibrant nose art. Every time a pilot pushed the throttle forward, felt the engine rumble beneath him, or dove into danger, he carried a part of Johnson's legacy with him, a reminder that the aircraft could take punishment and still fight back. Meanwhile, back home, Republic Aviation expanded production. More P-47s rolled off the lines. More pilots climbed into cockpits. More families waited anxiously for news. And the engineers continued refining the design. Stronger engines, better gun sights, improved cooling systems. Every improvement was built on lessons learned from men like Robert S. Johnson. His dive wasn't just a story. It was data, evidence, proof that the fighter's strength was unmatched. Years after the war, historians and aviation experts would revisit the details of Johnson's encounter. They would analyze the structural performance of the P-47 at high speeds, the aerodynamic limits of the FW-190, and the situational factors that shaped the outcome. They would study the dive angle, altitude loss, control stiffness, and the way radial engines absorb damage. In textbooks and technical documents, the event would be dissected scientifically. But the human moment, the fear, the courage, the glance exchange between two pilots, remained something only Johnson could truly understand. And perhaps that's what made it unforgettable. Because in the end, war is not fought by machines alone. It's fought by people, individuals facing impossible odds, making split-second decisions, carrying the weight of life and death in their hands. The P-47 gave Johnson a chance to survive, but Johnson gave the P-47 its legend. As our documentary closes, imagine the sound of a radial engine echoing through a cold hangar. Imagine the glint of sunlight reflecting off weathered aluminum. Imagine the vibration of a fighter diving at speeds that bend the sky. These machines weren't perfect, but they were built for moments that tested the limits of steel and spirit. Robert S. Johnson became a symbol of that union, man and machine facing the impossible together. And as you reflect on his story, ask yourself one question. What would you have done, hurtling toward the earth in a shaking, bullet-riddled fighter, knowing an enemy was right behind you? Stories like this remind us of something timeless. Courage isn't about being fearless. It's about choosing to fight even when fear is overwhelming. If this story moved you, share the moment that struck you most. Sometimes the smallest detail, a sound, a gesture, a glance, can reveal more about history than any statistic. And for now, let the engine fade, and the sky grow quiet. As the Thunderbolt glides back into memory,